Section 1. Mia's head was pounding. A slow, rhythmic throb pulsed behind her temples, making her groan softly as she stirred. The lingering scent of expensive cologne filled her nose, a scent both foreign and intoxicating. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she had ever slept on, and the silk sheet slid against her skin like a whisper. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't her bed. Panic jolted through her as her eyes snapped open. The first thing she noticed was the sheer size of the room, far bigger than her entire apartment. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across one side, offering an unobstructed view of the glittering city skyline. The decor was sleek, modern, and undeniably expensive, with dark marble floors, minimalist furnishings, and warm lighting casting a golden glow. Oh no. Mia swallowed hard, trying to ignore the creeping realization clawing its way through her mind. She turned her head slowly, her pulse racing, and there, beside her, lay a man. Not just any man, Ethan King. Her breath hitched in her throat. He was sprawled on his back, the sheets barely covering his lower half. His toned chest rose and fell in steady, even breaths, and the dim light of dawn highlighted the sharp angles of his jaw, the curve of his lips, the dark lashes resting against his cheekbones. His short, slightly tousled black hair made him look impossibly perfect, like something straight out of a dream or a nightmare. Mia clenched the sheets around her, resisting the urge to scream. What had she done? Memories of the previous night flooded back in disjointed flashes. The club, the music pulsing through her veins, the feel of his hands on her waist as they danced, the way his lips had brushed against her ear when he whispered something she couldn't quite remember. And then, Mia squeezed her eyes shut. She had slept with Ethan King, not just a random stranger. The Ethan King, a billionaire, a ruthless businessman, the kind of man who made front-page headlines with his high-profile deals and infamous scandals. And now she was waking up in his bed. Mia's stomach twisted into knots. This couldn't be happening. Her eyes darted toward the floor, scanning for her dress. She spotted it in a crumpled heap near the edge of the bed and slowly reached for it, careful not to disturb the sleeping man beside her. If she could just slip out unnoticed. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Mia froze. The deep, husky voice sent a shiver down her spine. She turned slowly, her heart hammering as she met Ethan's piercing blue eyes. He was awake, and he was watching her. A lazy smirk played on his lips, amusement flickering in his gaze as he propped himself up on one elbow. "In a hurry?" Mia swallowed. Ethan's smirk deepened. "You look like you're about to run." Because she was. I have somewhere to be," she said quickly, gripping the sheets tighter. Ethan chuckled, the sound low and knowing. "At 6 in the morning?" Mia's cheeks burned. This was a disaster. "I should go," she blurted, grabbing her dress and clutching it against her chest. Ethan watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, raking a hand through his hair before sitting up fully. "All right," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "If that's what you want." Relief flooded Mia's chest. She slid out of bed as gracefully as possible, her feet hitting the cool marble floor. She scrambled into her dress, her hands trembling as she zipped it up. Ethan didn't stop her, but she could feel his eyes on her the entire time. By the time she reached the bedroom door, her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. "Mia," she hesitated. For a split second she considered pretending she hadn't heard him, but something in his tone, something almost curious, made her pause. She turned, gripping the doorknob tightly. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. "Are you sure you don't want to stay?" Mia forced a smile. "I'm sure." His lips curved slightly. Pity. Mia didn't wait for him to say anything else. She pushed the door open and walked out. This never happened. That's what she told herself as she hurried barefoot down the hall, past the elegant paintings and sleek furniture, toward the massive penthouse elevator. She would never see him again. She pressed the elevator button, her heart pounding. A ding echoed through the quiet space and the doors slid open. She stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby with shaky fingers. As the elevator descended, she let out a long, shaky breath. It's over. You're free. She just had to forget about it, forget about him. Forget about the way he had looked at her, touched her, made her feel. Because this was just a mistake, right? Mia rushed into her apartment, kicking off her heels the second she stepped inside. She leaned against the door, exhaling sharply. Never again. She had never done something so reckless in her life. What had possessed her to go home with a man she barely knew? Not just any man, a billionaire. She groaned, running a hand through her tangled hair. She needed to shower, she needed coffee, and most importantly, she needed to pretend last night never happened. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She grabbed it, checking the screen. A message from her boss. Her stomach sank. She had taken the weekend off, but the text was marked urgent. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she reluctantly opened it. Come in first thing Monday. We have a new investor, and you'll be working closely with him. Mia frowned. That was unusual. She wasn't high enough in the company to be involved with investors, but she couldn't afford to question it. She needed this job. Her rent was due soon, and she was barely keeping up with her bills. Whatever her boss needed, she would handle it. She placed her phone down, letting out a slow breath. One more day to recover, and then back to work. Back to normal. Back to a life that didn't involve Ethan King. At least that's what she thought. But fate had other plans. Section 2. Mia woke up Monday morning with an uneasy feeling in her chest. Despite telling herself she had moved on from the events of that wild night, her mind betrayed her. She had spent the entire weekend pushing thoughts of Ethan King out of her head, but it was like trying to fight gravity. The way he had looked at her, the deep, knowing smirk, the way his voice had wrapped around her like silk, making it impossible to think straight. She groaned into her pillow before forcing herself out of bed. It didn't matter. She would never see him again. With that firm thought in her head, she got dressed, pulling on her usual work attire, black slacks, a pale blue blouse, and low heels. She tied her hair into a neat ponytail and grabbed her bag before heading out. The subway ride was a blur. She spent most of it glancing at the message from her boss over and over again. Come in first thing Monday. We have a new investor and you'll be working closely with him. Something about it felt off. Mia worked in the marketing department of a mid-sized firm, Anderson & Company. She wasn't high up in the company, just another employee trying to make ends meet. The only reason she had even landed the job was her attention to detail and relentless work ethic. She never worked directly with investors. Her nerves buzzed as she walked into the office building, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. The receptionist greeted her with a forced smile, and she noticed the slight tension in the air. Something was definitely going on. Before she could overthink it, her boss, Mr. Reynolds, stepped into the lobby and spotted her. There you are, he said, his expression a mix of relief and urgency. Come with me. We need to go over the transition process before the meeting. Mia frowned. Transition? Mr. Reynolds sighed as they walked toward his office. We've had a major investor buy a controlling stake in the company. He's not just investing, he's taking over. Mia's steps faltered. Wait, taking over as in? Yes, Mr. Reynolds said, rubbing his temples. New ownership, new CEO. Mia's stomach twisted. And I'm working closely with this person? Yes, he confirmed, effective immediately. She blinked. But why me? Mr. Reynolds hesitated, avoiding her gaze. It was his request. Mia froze. A creeping sense of dread slithered down her spine. No way, this couldn't be happening. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe. It had to be a coincidence. Her boss opened the door to his office and gestured for her to step inside. Wait here, he's arriving soon. Mia numbly walked in and sat down. Her mind raced, trying to piece together a logical explanation. It's not him. It's not him. It's not him. She repeated the words like a mantra, trying to will the universe to comply. But then the door swung open, and he walked in. Ethan King. Mia's breath caught in her throat. He was just as devastatingly handsome as she remembered, if not more. Dressed in a dark, tailored suit that accentuated his tall, powerful frame, he exuded the effortless confidence of a man who owned everything around him, including the air she was breathing. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, there was silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Then the corner of his lips lifted. Miss Carter, he said smoothly, his deep voice laced with amusement. We meet again. Mia's heart nearly stopped. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Mr. Reynolds, completely oblivious to the tension crackling between them, cleared his throat. Mr. King, this is Mia Carter. She'll be assisting you directly as you transition into your new role. Ethan smiled, slow and deliberate. Yes, he murmured. I'm already quite familiar with Miss Carter. Mia wanted to die. Her fingers curled around the edge of her chair, her pulse pounding in her ears. Mr. Reynolds, sensing nothing, gave a forced chuckle. Well, that makes things easier. Ethan's gaze never left hers. Mia was trapped, pinned under the weight of those ocean blue eyes. She needed to get out. Now, I should, she started, but Ethan cut her off. Leave us, he said, his voice firm. Mr. Reynolds hesitated. Excuse me? Ethan flicked his gaze toward him. You're dismissed. Mia's boss blinked in shock but nodded stiffly. Of course. I'll leave you two to discuss the transition. He walked out, shutting the door behind him. Silence filled the office. Mia's stomach twisted into knots. Ethan leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. I have to say, he mused, tilting his head, I wasn't expecting this. Mia swallowed hard. Ethan. Mr. King, he corrected smoothly. At work, you'll address me properly. Mia's jaw clenched. This is a joke, right? You're not my new boss. Ethan smirked. Oh, but I am. Her breath hitched. Why? He pushed off the desk and stepped toward her, closing the distance between them with slow, calculated steps. Because, he murmured, his voice dropping to something almost dangerous, you walked away from me, and I don't like losing. Mia stared at him, her hands curled into fists. That's insane. Ethan chuckled. Is it? Yes, she snapped. You bought a company just to mess with me? He shrugged. Not entirely. Anderson and Company was a solid investment. You were just an unexpected bonus. Mia burned with frustration. She stood abruptly, pushing back her chair. Well, congratulations. You own the company, but you don't own me. Ethan's eyes darkened. A slow, predatory smile spread across his lips. We'll see about that. Mia's breath caught. A challenge. A promise. Panic flared in her chest, but she refused to let him see it. She lifted her chin, schooling her expression into something unreadable. I have work to do. Ethan's smirk deepened. Then get to it, Miss Carter. She turned sharply and stormed out of the office, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. Her hands trembled as she walked down the hall. Ethan King had just inserted himself into her life. And worse, he wasn't letting her go. Section 3. Mia stormed into her tiny office, slamming the door shut behind her. Her heart was still hammering from her confrontation with Ethan. Of all the people in the world, why him? She pressed her fingers to her temples, inhaling deeply. Ethan King was not just her boss. He was not just a billionaire investor. He was the man she had spent the night with, the man whose touch still haunted her dreams. And now he was determined to insert himself into her life. Mia dropped into her chair, exhaling shakily. She needed to think. Quitting was the logical choice. If she walked away now, she could avoid whatever twisted game Ethan was playing. But she clenched her fists. She couldn't just leave. This job was her lifeline. She had worked too hard to build her career. She wasn't going to throw it away because of some arrogant billionaire who thought he could control her. Besides, she refused to let Ethan win. If he thought she would run, he was wrong. Mia sat up straight, forcing her emotions under control. She would handle this professionally. Ethan could play whatever game he wanted. She wouldn't fall for it. A knock at the door made her stiffen. Before she could respond, it swung open. A tall, impeccably dressed woman with icy blue eyes stepped inside. Victoria Hale. Mia knew her immediately. She was Ethan's chief operations officer, and more importantly, his ex. The woman was stunning. Sleek blonde hair, a designer suit that screamed power, and a smirk that sent a cold chill down Mia's spine. Miss Carter, Victoria said, her voice smooth but condescending. We need to talk. Mia folded her arms. About what? Victoria stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She looked around the small office, nose wrinkling slightly. I'll get straight to the point, she said, crossing her arms. Whatever game you think you're playing with Ethan, end it now. Mia blinked. Game? She narrowed her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. Victoria let out a small laugh. Oh, please, she said, stepping closer. You think I don't know what this is? Mia frowned. This company was never on Ethan's radar until you walked in, Victoria continued, her voice sharp. And suddenly he buys it and makes you his personal assistant? Tell me, Mia, how exactly did you manage that? Mia clenched her fists. I didn't manage anything, she snapped. I don't control Ethan's decisions. Victoria scoffed. You expect me to believe that? She leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. Let me give you a warning, sweetheart. Ethan gets bored easily. Whatever this is, it won't last. Mia's blood boiled. Victoria's smugness, her assumption that Mia was just another plaything, made her stomach turn. Mia stood up slowly, leveling Victoria with a cold stare. I don't need your warnings, she said. I'm here to work, not to entertain your insecurities. Victoria's smirk vanished. Her eyes darkened. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, she hissed. Mia didn't flinch. I can handle myself, she said, voice steady. Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Victoria studied her for a long moment. Then she smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Good luck, Miss Carter, she murmured. With that, she turned on her heel and walked out, leaving Mia feeling strangely victorious, but also deeply uneasy. Something told her Victoria wasn't going to let this go. And worse, neither was Ethan. By the time Mia returned to her desk, she was determined to prove that she wouldn't let Ethan distract her. She buried herself in work, poring over reports and presentations for the upcoming investor meeting. Everything was fine. She was fine. Until her phone rang. She hesitated before answering. Mia Carter. Miss Carter. Ethan's voice came through the line, smooth and composed. Come to my office. Mia's stomach tightened. I'm busy, she said stiffly. There was a pause, then, Miss Carter. She knew that tone. It was the same one he had used the night they met. Commanding, amused, impossible to ignore. Her fingernails dug into her palm. I'll be right there, she muttered. She hung up, cursing under her breath. Mia grabbed her notebook, took a steadying breath, and walked toward his office. She was not going to let him get under her skin. She was going to stay professional, no matter what. The moment she stepped into his office, she realized just how wrong she had been. Ethan was leaning back in his chair, watching her with an unreadable expression. The room was dimly lit, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows casting a golden glow across the sleek interior. It felt too intimate, too dangerous. Mia clenched her jaw. You needed something? Ethan's lips twitched. Yes, he said, standing up. Take a seat. She hesitated. Then slowly she walked to the chair opposite his desk and sat down. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then he said the words that made her stomach drop. You left without saying goodbye. Mia's breath hitched. Her hands tightened into fists beneath the desk. She knew he was talking about that night. She forced herself to stay composed. That was intentional, she said. Ethan let out a low chuckle. Cold, he murmured. I like it. Mia swallowed hard. I don't know what game you're playing, she said, keeping her voice steady. But I'm not interested. Ethan's gaze darkened. Oh, but you are, he said smoothly. Mia's pulse jumped. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. Her nails dug into her palm. I work here because I need a job, she said. That's it. Ethan smirked. Is that what you tell yourself? Mia's heart pounded. She was not going to let him win. She refused to let him get the upper hand. I'm here to do my job, she said. And nothing else. Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low murmur. Then do it well, Miss Carter. Mia stiffened. There was something in his tone, a warning, a promise. She stood up abruptly. We're done here. Ethan watched her with amusement. For now, he said. Mia stormed out, her heart pounding. She had won this round. But something told her Ethan King was just getting started. And the worst part? She wasn't sure she could resist. Section 4. Mia didn't stop moving until she was back at her desk. She sat down, exhaling sharply, pressing her hands against the cool surface in an attempt to steady herself. What just happened? She had faced plenty of difficult bosses before, had handled rude clients, demanding executives and impossible deadlines. But Ethan King was an entirely different beast. His confidence was unshakable. His amusement at her resistance was infuriating. And worst of all, he was getting under her skin. Mia took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing of her heart. She couldn't afford to let Ethan's games distract her. If he wanted to play cat and mouse, she would ignore it. If he thought she was an easy conquest, he was dead wrong. This job was too important for her to risk losing it over some arrogant billionaire who thought the world revolved around him. She squared her shoulders, grabbed her files, and decided to pretend nothing had happened. As far as she was concerned, Ethan was just another boss, and she was going to keep it that way. The day moved in a blur. Mia buried herself in work, doing her best to avoid Ethan's presence, but it was impossible. His name was everywhere. Emails, calls, meetings, everything revolved around him. Her phone pinged and she hesitated before checking the screen. Ethan King, my office. Now Mia clenched her jaw. Was he serious? She ignored it. Another message popped up seconds later. Ethan King. I wouldn't ignore me if I were you, Miss Carter. Mia shut her eyes briefly, inhaling through her nose before standing up. She was not going to let him push her around. She was going to handle this professionally. She made her way to his office, knocked once, and entered. Ethan was leaning back in his chair, watching her with that infuriating smirk. She hated how he looked at her, as if she was some sort of puzzle he was trying to figure out. "You rang?" she said flatly. Ethan chuckled. "Sit." Mia didn't move. "I'm busy." He arched an eyebrow. "So am I, but you're still here." She clenched her fists. "What do you want?" Ethan studied her for a moment before pushing a folder across his desk. "Your next assignment." Mia frowned. "That's it?" She reached for the folder, flipping it open, scanning the contents, and froze. Her stomach dropped. Her next assignment was to accompany Ethan to a business gala that evening, as his date. She snapped the folder shut. "No." Ethan tilted his head. "Excuse me." "I'm not going," she said firmly. Ethan leaned forward, his expression dangerously amused. "You work for me, Mia." "That doesn't mean I'm your date," she shot back. His smirk deepened. "It does tonight." Mia's blood boiled. This was not happening. "I am not some escort you can just summon whenever you need arm candy," she snapped. Ethan let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "I don't need an escort, Mia." His voice dropped slightly, sending shivers down her spine. "If I did, you wouldn't be my first choice." Mia's breath hitched. She should be insulted. Instead, a different kind of heat spread through her body. She shoved it aside, forcing herself to focus. "I'm still not going," she said stiffly. Ethan leaned back, watching her with interest. "Then you're fired." Mia's heart stopped. She stared at him, shocked. "You wouldn't." Ethan shrugged. "Try me." Her hands tightened into fists. The worst part? She knew he wasn't bluffing. Ethan King was ruthless. If she pushed him too far, he would absolutely fire her without a second thought. Mia's stomach churned. She couldn't lose this job. She needed it. She hated that he had this power over her. Ethan watched her, waiting. She could see it in his smug expression. He knew she would cave. He knew she had no choice. Mia swallowed hard, gritting her teeth. "Fine," she muttered. Ethan's smirk widened. "Good girl." Mia's blood boiled, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was just one night. She would go to the event, do her job, and then walk away. She wouldn't let him win. Hours later, Mia stood in front of her mirror, staring at her reflection. The dress was stunning. A sleek black gown that hugged her curves in all the right places. It was the most expensive thing she had ever worn. It wasn't hers, of course. Ethan had sent it, along with jewelry that probably cost more than her entire apartment. Mia took a deep breath, smoothing her hands down the fabric. This is just a job. She wasn't going to let Ethan's mind games get to her. A knock at the door made her jump. She turned, hesitating for a brief moment before opening it. Ethan stood there, dressed in an impossibly sharp tuxedo. He looked, she swallowed, annoyingly good. His eyes swept over her, and for the first time that night he didn't smirk. Something flashed in his gaze. Something dark, something unreadable. Mia's breath caught. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded, stepping out, shutting the door behind her. Ethan offered his arm. Mia stared at it for a moment before reluctantly looping her hand through his. He leaned down slightly, his lips dangerously close to her ear. "You look stunning," he murmured. Mia's heart pounded. She pulled away. "We should go." Ethan chuckled, leading her toward the waiting car. Mia exhaled shakily. This night was going to be dangerous, and she just hoped she would make it through unscathed. Section 5. The drive to the gala was silent, but it was anything but peaceful. Mia kept her gaze fixed out the window, her fingers clenched together in her lap. She could feel Ethan watching her. Every now and then, she caught his reflection in the glass, his eyes flickering toward her, studying her. She refused to look back. She had no idea what game he was playing, but she would not let him win. Ethan finally broke the silence. "You're unusually quiet." Mia exhaled slowly. "I don't have anything to say." He smirked. "That's a first." She turned to glare at him. "What do you expect me to say? That I'm excited to be your fake date? That I love being forced into this?" Ethan chuckled. "I don't need you to love it, Mia. I just need you to look like you do." Her teeth gritted. "Unbelievable." He leaned back, amused. "Relax, you're overthinking this." Mia let out a short, humorless laugh. "Overthinking? Ethan, you blackmailed me into this." He shrugged. "It's just business." Mia's blood boiled. Of course, everything was just business to him. Nothing was real. Not emotions, not relationships, not people. She turned away again, forcing herself to breathe. The gala was only a few hours. She could survive a few hours. She had to. When they arrived at the event, Mia realized just how out of place she felt. The venue was stunning. A grand ballroom with crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, and men and women dripping in luxury. Everyone here was someone. Wealthy, influential, powerful. She was none of those things. She stepped out of the car hesitantly, but before she could take another step, Ethan's hand was at her lower back. She stiffened. His touch was warm, firm, too familiar. She turned to look at him, startled. "What are you doing?" she whispered. He smiled at her like it was the most natural thing in the world, making it look convincing. Mia's stomach tightened. This was not part of the plan. She had expected to be introduced as his assistant, maybe his business associate, not whatever this was. Ethan guided her forward, effortlessly leading her through the crowd. People turned to look. They recognized him immediately, and then they looked at her. The whispers started. Mia felt them. Who is she? Ethan King never brings a date. Is she new? A secret girlfriend? Her heart pounded. This was a mistake, a huge mistake. She glanced at Ethan, expecting to see him tense, irritated by the attention. Instead, he looked completely unbothered. More than that, he looked amused. He liked this. He liked the whispers, the curiosity, the eyes on them. He wanted this. Mia hated it. She wasn't here to be put on display. She wasn't here to entertain his games. She was here because she had no choice. They had barely been inside for 10 minutes before someone approached them. "Mia," Ethan murmured, leaning down slightly. "Meet James Calloway. He's one of our biggest investors." Mia turned, forcing herself to smile. James was an older man dressed in an expensive tux, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I don't believe we've met," he said, extending a hand. Mia shook it politely. "Mia Carter." His gaze flickered toward Ethan. "Your date for the evening?" Mia opened her mouth to correct him, but Ethan beat her to it. "Something like that," Ethan said smoothly. Mia's breath caught. James smiled knowingly. "Well, I have to say, Ethan, you're full of surprises." Ethan chuckled. "Aren't I always?" James turned back to Mia, still studying her. She hated it. She hated being analyzed as if she was some unknown factor in Ethan's world. She hated that Ethan was letting it happen. "I hope you don't mind me asking," James continued, "but what do you do, Miss Carter?" Mia hesitated. This was it. This was where Ethan told them the truth, that she was just his assistant, that this was all a game. She waited for him to say it, but he didn't. Instead, Ethan smiled, his arm tightening around her waist. "She's someone very important to me." Mia's stomach dropped. James raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Ethan nodded, his gaze never leaving Mia's. And then, to her horror, he leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "I told you," he murmured. "We need to make it convincing." Mia's entire body stiffened. This was too much, too intimate, too close, and worst of all, too dangerous. Because for a split second she forgot it was an act. For a split second she let herself feel it. His warmth, his touch, the way his voice sent a shiver down her spine. And that was exactly why she needed to end this. Mia forced a smile. She turned to James, pretending she wasn't seconds away from losing her mind. "It was nice meeting you, Mr. Calloway." And before Ethan could stop her, she pulled away and walked off. Mia didn't stop until she reached the balcony. The cool air hit her, making her head clear. What the hell was she doing? She had agreed to this, yes, but not to whatever game Ethan was playing. She needed to set boundaries, and she needed to remind him that this was just a job, not whatever he thought it was turning into. She took a deep breath. Calm down. She just needed a minute, just 1 minute to get herself together. "Mia." She froze, and she turned, and there he was. Ethan stood in the doorway watching her, his eyes dark. She exhaled sharply. "Ethan, why did you run?" Mia scoffed. Oh, don't start." "I'm serious," he stepped forward. "I want an answer." Mia crossed her arms. "Because I don't like playing your little games." Ethan tilted his head as if considering that. And then, he did something unexpected. He smiled, a real smile. Not his usual smug, infuriating smirk. A genuine smile. It threw her completely off guard. "Not a fan of games, huh?" he mused. Mia narrowed her eyes. "Not when I'm the pawn." Ethan's gaze softened. "You're not a pawn, Mia." She didn't believe him. He took another step forward, her breath hitched. "Then what am I?" she whispered. Ethan was so close now. She could feel his warmth, see the flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. And then, just when she thought he was going to say something, he reached out, brushed a stray curl from her face, and said, "You're the only part of this that feels real." Mia's heart stopped. Before she could react, before she could think, Ethan turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, breathless, shaken, and completely unsure of what to do next. Section 6. Mia stood on the balcony long after Ethan had walked away. Her mind was a mess. She replayed his words over and over again. "You're the only part of this that feels real." What the hell did that even mean? Was he messing with her? Was this just another one of his games? Or worse, was he actually serious? Mia hated that she didn't know the answer. She hated that for a split second she wanted to believe him. Numbers, she needed to get a grip. This was not real. Ethan was a billionaire. A man who lived his life surrounded by luxury, power, and women who actually belonged in his world. Mia was just his assistant, a temporary distraction at best, and she refused to be another woman he discarded when he got bored. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders. Whatever this was, it needed to end. She had let things go too far tonight. Ethan could play his fake relationship all he wanted, but she wasn't going to let herself get caught up in it. Not again. The rest of the night passed agonizingly slow. Mia avoided Ethan as much as possible. She kept herself busy, making polite conversation with guests, doing her best to appear like she wasn't having a full-on mental breakdown. Ethan, to her surprise, didn't seek her out again, which should have been a relief, but instead, it bothered her. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her from across the room, that he was giving her space on purpose. It was infuriating. She should have been grateful that he was backing off. Instead, she felt restless, frustrated, like something had shifted between them and she had no control over it. By the time the gala finally ended, Mia was exhausted. She was more than ready to go home, forget this night ever happened, and get back to reality. But of course, Ethan had other plans. The car ride back to her apartment was silent. Mia stared out the window, mentally willing Ethan not to say anything. She didn't want to talk, and she didn't want to acknowledge whatever happened tonight. She just wanted to get home and pretend it never happened. But Ethan wasn't one to stay silent for long. "Are you going to ignore me all night?" Mia sighed. "I was hoping to." Ethan smirked. Cold. She turned to glare at him. "I'm serious, Ethan. Whatever happened back there?" "Back where?" he cut in smoothly. Mia gritted her teeth. "At the gala." Ethan just stared at her, completely unbothered. "And what exactly happened at the gala, Mia?" She exhaled sharply. "You know exactly what I'm talking about." His smirk widened. "Do I?" Mia's jaw clenched. He was enjoying this. She refused to give him the satisfaction. "I don't have time for your games," she muttered, turning back toward the window. Ethan let out a short laugh. "You keep saying that, Mia, but I think you like playing them just as much as I do." She snapped her head back toward him. "Excuse me?" Ethan leaned back in his seat, watching her closely. "You could have left the gala at any time," he pointed out. "You didn't have to stay and play along." Mia hated that he was right. She should have left. She should have walked away the second she realized he was making this personal. But she hadn't, and now she was stuck in something she couldn't control. She stared at him, at the way his expression was still calm, still too unreadable. And suddenly she needed answers, needed to know why he was doing this. "Why me?" she asked before she could stop herself. Ethan's brows lifted. Mia swallowed. "Why are you doing this? What do you get out of it?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, then he smirked. "Maybe I just like you." Mia's stomach dropped, her hands fisted in her lap. "You don't," she said quietly. Ethan raised a brow. "Oh, you like the idea of me," she continued. "You like the challenge." Ethan didn't deny it, but he also didn't confirm it. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze intense. "What if I told you you're wrong?" Mia's breath hitched. Ethan watched her reaction closely, as if waiting for her to fall into his trap. She refused. "Then I'd say you're lying." Ethan laughed, not his usual amused chuckle, but something real, something low and deep that sent a shiver down her spine. "You are so stubborn," he murmured, shaking his head. Mia crossed her arms. "And you are so manipulative." Ethan just smirked. Mia sighed, turning away. This conversation is over. For now, he agreed. She hated how certain he sounded. She hated that part of her was curious to know what he meant, because deep down, she had a feeling this was only the beginning. When they pulled up to her apartment, Mia didn't wait for Ethan to open the door for her. She got out quickly, making a beeline for the entrance. But she didn't make it far. Ethan grabbed her wrist, stopping her in her tracks. Mia froze. She turned, startled by the heat in his gaze. Ethan took a step closer. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Mia, he said softly. It was the first time he had said her name like that, like it actually meant something. Mia's heart pounded and she needed to pull away, needed to end this before it was too late. But then Ethan's grip tightened and before she could stop him, he leaned down and kissed her. Section 10. Mia sat in her apartment staring at the ceiling. Her heart was still racing from what had just happened. Liam. She hadn't seen him in years, had never wanted to see him again. But now he was back, and she had no idea why. Her phone buzzed. She didn't want to look, didn't want to see his name. But when she glanced at the screen, it wasn't Liam. It was Ethan. Ethan, are you okay? Mia swallowed hard. Was she? She didn't know, but she did know that the second she saw Liam's face, something inside her had shattered. And now she was terrified because he had looked at her the same way he always did, like he was in control, like he could just waltz back into her life and she'd let him. Mia's hands curled into fists. Number, not this time, and she wouldn't let him break her again. Her phone buzzed again. Ethan. Mia. She hesitated. Then slowly she typed, Mia, I don't know. A second later, Ethan, I'm coming over. Her stomach twisted. She should tell him no. She should tell him she needed space, but she didn't. Instead, she just sat there, waiting. 15 minutes later, Ethan was at her door. Mia barely had time to react before he walked inside. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they were burning. Tell me everything, he said. Mia exhaled. She wanted to lie, to pretend she was fine, but she wasn't. And Ethan wasn't going to let this go. She took a shaky breath. Liam and I met when I was 20, she whispered. I thought I loved him. Ethan didn't move, didn't even breathe. Mia looked down at her hands. He was charming, attentive, but after a few months, things started to change. Her throat tightened. Ethan's jaw clenched. How? He asked, his voice low. Mia's chest ached. He wanted to control everything, she murmured. What I wore, where I went, who I talked to. Her stomach twisted. And when I didn't listen, Ethan's fingers curled into fists. Mia looked away. I thought it was my fault, she whispered. I thought, if I just did what he wanted, things would get better. Ethan exhaled sharply. But they didn't, she continued. They got worse, and one night She stopped. Because that night, the night everything broke, she couldn't say it. Ethan was still silent, but his body was rigid, like he was holding himself together by a thread. Mia forced a breath. I left him, she whispered. I packed a bag and disappeared. Her hands trembled, and for a moment, the room was completely silent. Then, Ethan spoke. If he ever comes near you again, his voice was dangerous. I will destroy him. Mia's breath hitched, because she knew he meant it. And for the first time since Liam had reappeared, she didn't feel so afraid. The next few days were quiet. Liam didn't show up again, but Mia knew he wasn't gone. She could feel it. And Ethan? Ethan was always there, checking in, making sure she was safe. And the more time they spent together, the harder it became to ignore the truth. Mia wasn't running anymore, not from him, not from this. But what if she let him in? And he walked away. What if she got hurt again? She wasn't sure she could survive it, and then everything exploded. It happened 3 days later. Mia was leaving work. The office parking garage was mostly empty. She was about to get in her car when she heard it. A voice. Mia. Her heart stopped. She turned, and there he was. Liam. Her pulse pounded. Because this wasn't a coincidence. What do you want? She asked, keeping her voice steady. Liam smiled, like this was some kind of game. I never got to finish our conversation, he said smoothly. Mia's fingers tightened around her keys. There's nothing left to say. Liam's smile faded. You don't mean that. Her stomach twisted, because this was how it always started. The sweet words, the fake regret, and then the manipulation. She stepped back. "I'm leaving," she said firmly. But before she could turn, he grabbed her wrist. Panic shot through her. "Mia," his voice was low, "you and I both know this isn't over." She yanked away, but he was stronger, and suddenly, she was trapped. Her heart pounded and her skin crawled, and for the first time in years, she felt helpless. And then, a voice cut through the air. "Let her go." Mia's breath hitched, because standing 10 feet away was Ethan. Liam let go immediately. His face paled. "Ethan?" Ethan looked murderous. His entire body was tense, and the look in his eyes, it was deadly. Mia shook because she had never seen him like this, not ever. Liam swallowed hard. "Relax," he muttered. I wasn't." Ethan's fist collided with his face. Liam stumbled back. Blood spilled from his nose. And Ethan? Ethan didn't even flinch. He just stood there, dangerous, powerful, unstoppable. "Come near her again," Ethan growled, "and I swear I will ruin you." Liam's eyes widened because he knew Ethan wasn't bluffing. Not this time. Liam turned and ran, and just like that, he was gone. Mia's entire body shook. Ethan turned to her. His expression softened. "Mia." She collapsed into his arms, and for the first time, she let herself fall. That night, Mia lay beside him. For the first time, she didn't feel scared and didn't feel alone, because Ethan was hers and she was his. No more running, no more fear, no more walls. She looked at him and whispered, "I love you." Ethan's breath caught. Then he pulled her close and murmured, "I love you too." And this time, it was real. It was forever. What did you think of Mia and Ethan's journey? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories, or incredible stories, or incredible